Welcome everyone to another episode of the ResearchWorks podcast. We're back again that time of the week. So glad you could join us. And back onto hosting duties is Marissa. Hello Marissa, welcome back.
Hello, thanks for having me again.
Obviously it means you're doing a good job, like to keep coming back.
I like it. I learn lots every time, so happy to be back.
Well, this one is going to be a particularly interesting one. It's definitely stirred up a lot of conversation within the office as well, because I realised that I know very little about this. But it's all over the news, and for that we're talking about vaping. I don't know, I just see every time I turn on the news, there's always a horror story about it. There's so much going on and I know nothing about it. And so for that reason, I've been really keen to talk to Associate Professor Alexander Larcombe. So thank you for coming into the studio and for some of your time today, Alex.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
Oh, it's so nice to have you.
I too am one of those people from the office who was very looking forward to learning from you today, Alex. For everyone, all of our listeners, the paper that we'll be centring our conversation on today is your article titled Chemical Analysis of Fresh and Aged Australian E-Cigarette Liquids, published in the Medical Journal of Australia, and Electronic Cigarette Usage Patterns and Perceptions in Adult Australians, published in Toxics in 2023. Now, for our listeners, let's tell them a bit more about Alex.
Let's do that. This is the most hard part to listen to, isn't it?
It's
about
okay.
yourself.
Yeah.
I always find this so interesting.
It's
amazing.
great. This is a great bio.
Okay. Associate Professor Alexander Larcombe began work at the Telethon Institute in 2005 and is now a Senior Research Fellow and Head of the Respiratory Environmental Health Team. During his time at the Institute, Alex has led many research projects, primarily investigating the physiological and developmental consequences of exposure to a range of environmental insults, including allergen exposure, respiratory viral infection, pollutants, including electronic cigarette aerosols and tobacco smoke, and climate change. Alex's research has shown how exposure to such insults in early life, including in utero, can have significant impacts on lung growth and lung function and lead to lifelong respiratory disease.
Wow. So very, very interesting and so important to so many people. So I was just saying as you're walking in, I feel like I see you more in the news these days, and this is the first time I've actually seen you in person. So yeah, hold on to your horses, everyone. We're going to ask all the questions. But before we get into that, of course, we have our icebreaker question, which is the one we always worry about the most.
This is quite interesting today. So, Alex, what chocolate best describes you?
This was the hardest question already. It's already the hardest question. I haven't heard the rest of them. I think that I'm just a block of Cadbury Dairy Milk. Just the plain, maybe a little bit boring, but reliable, gets the job done, and it's always there. It's always available. So that's what I think I am. Nothing fancy, but sort of utilitarian and get the job done.
But everyone likes that too.
Everyone likes it.
I'd like to think everyone likes me, but I don't know. With this sort of topic, it's easy to annoy people and rub people the wrong way. So,
no, that's a good answer. Like, that's really well thought through. Well, what about you, Marissa? Let's go to you first.
I'm going to say I'm like an aero bar. Not that they're my favourite bar, but I think I'm quite bubbly.
You are quite bubbly.
Nothing too crazy, so I'm not too out there. I'm still relatively, simple in terms of like what I dress and how I am. So I'm not a crazy outgoing bar, chocolate bar. So
but
maybe
enjoyable.
Maybe a bubbly.
Yeah, bubbly.
Yeah.
That's a nice one.
Yeah.
I quite like that.
I think Cadbury have a version of that, but I don't know. Anyway.
Oh, yeah, I'd never know which one it
don't know
belongs
who
to.
makes that.
Yeah,
No.
What about you, Dana?
Okay, so for me, I think my favourite chocolate is the Snickers bar, but I don't think I'm a Snickers. I don't think that describes me. I think I'm
a bit nutty.
A bit nutty, yeah. I feel like, then there's the nougat, there's so many inferences from there. But I think maybe I'm a Twix bar. Like, I feel like the biscuity base, it's like a solid foundation. I feel like I know who I am, what I stand for, what my values are. That's a solid foundation. But the gooey caramel on top's that little bit of arty, creative part of me that kind of just goes off a little bit, just runs into it a little bit, but it's contained within the chocolate. So I feel like that describes me.
I think that's a great analogy. And to be honest, now I really want chocolate.
So do I.
Yeah.
And a Twix.
I didn't bring any.
We should have brought some in today. That was actually a downfall of that question. We'll learn that for next time. We'll owe you a chocolate bar for next time.
Okay,
and I know
sounds good.
Yeah, no, let's do that. But let's get into the topic. All right, so e-cigarette use is common in Australia with a notable uptake of e-cigarettes in Australians aged over 60 years. E-cigarette use has often been seen as a potential way to quit or reduce tobacco smoking. Yet, in Australia, use of e-cigarettes more than doubled in all adults aged over 18 years. The perception is that e-cigarettes are completely safe to use long term. However, this is not well supported in the literature.
Alex, I have so many questions. I have so much to learn about this. But let's start right at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about what is an e-cigarette and what is vaping?
Absolutely. So they're interchangeable terms.
Oh, okay.
So you vape with an e-cigarette,
Okay.
or you also vape with a vape. So the younger crowd generally calls them vapes or a few other sorts of names, but they're the same thing.
Okay.
That's the process, and the device is vaping generally.
Yep.
And they're pretty ubiquitous now. So basically what an e-cigarette does, or a vape, heats up a liquid. It's got a battery in it, usually a lithium-ion battery. You press a button, heats up a small amount of liquid in there that's either in a little container or it's soaked into a sponge in the disposable ones. Heats that up to a couple of hundred degrees, 250 to 300 degrees, makes it aerosolized, so you're effectively making like a steam, although it's not water.
Yeah.
And then the user breathes that in. They take their finger off the button, it cools down again, ready for the next time. And you can do that now. Some of the disposable ones have multiple thousands, 10,000 puffs in them. So you can do that thousands and thousands of times. And you breathe in your mouth full of aerosol.
Okay.
It's not vapor, even though it's called vaping. It's aerosol. It's a different thing, which is solid and liquid particles. And that stuff contains all the bits that the person breathes in.
Wow. Okay.
The fact that it works via battery and gets to that high temperature, that's quite amazing as well.
Yeah, so that's one of the main issues with the disposable ones, which are the sort of the most popular ones now. You've probably seen them in the gutter walking around the streets. Yeah. It's a lithium-ion battery in there. Which is obviously a huge environmental hazard. And at the tip, they cause lots of fires. Oh, no. As when they get damaged, they catch on fire, and huge environmental impacts, which is not what we're here to talk about today. We'll talk about the health stuff. But when people throw them away after using them for a couple of weeks, that's what happens. Plastic and metals and nasties go into our environment.
Wow, I never quite understood how they worked. So it's by battery. That's incredible. Interesting. Okay, next question to kind of clarify and demyth for us is it illegal? And is it different for under 18s compared to over 18s, or is it just blanket? We're kind of confused as to where the line is drawn.
It's understandable that it's confusing. The law for these sorts of things changes every 5 minutes, and different jurisdictions in Australia have different rules, which is a lot of researchers and advocacy people are trying to sort of make it consistent because it is so confusing and it changes so often. But in WA, yes, they're illegal. So you're not allowed to sell e-cigarettes or anything that resembles an e-cigarette or any part of an e-cigarette, because a lot of the sort of non-disposable devices have interchangeable parts, so you can't sell even individual parts of them. You're not allowed to sell the liquid that goes into them, regardless of whether it contains nicotine or not. So the sale of them, providing them to people, is 100% illegal. Owning them is a bit of a grey area.
Oh my goodness.
So it's illegal in Western Australia to have ones with nicotine in them if you don't have a doctor's prescription or a special permit. So all the disposable ones that are being used by the younger people in particular are super high in nicotine, so they are 100% illegal to have, to sell, to import, all the rest of it.
What?
Yeah, and WA is a bit weird in that most of the states in Australia are similar to that. So it's the nicotine that is the concerning part. But in WA, you're allowed to use vapes in certain areas where you're not allowed to, where you can't smoke. In other states, if you can't smoke there, then you're not allowed to vape. WA is a bit more lenient for some reason in that aspect, and you can vape legally in areas where you aren't allowed to smoke if that particular place says that it's okay. So if they don't have a policy, it's not against the law to vape like in a restaurant, unless the restaurant says, please don't do that.
Wow.
That's what I was wondering.
Everywhere else in Australia it is illegal to do that. You can't vape where you can't smoke, which is pretty much everywhere. But WA is a bit lagging in that.
That's so confusing in itself. So it's illegal to buy.
You can't have it in the first place. That's right.
Yes. But there's shops around. I drive by them all the time. So
yes, they're breaking the law. If they're selling anything if they're selling vapes or any of the parts of them, it's against the law. And there have been a small number of prosecutions in WA, some fines and that sort of things. And Department of Health, who's their compliance team who's working on that, is sort of cranking that up.
Yeah, sure.
But unfortunately, they're still super easy to get. There was a story in the West Australian just a couple of days ago where they went around to some of the vape stores and asked, got any of these ones? And I think something like half of the shops kind of went behind the counter and pulled some illegal ones out and said, here you go. So there's a thriving black market, and stopping them at the border is sort of one of the things that needs to crank up a bit in the near future.
Wow.
That was a whole new world.
Yeah.
Can you buy them online? Is that how people also access them as well? They just that's one of the main sources. Right. So there's if you type in vapes Australia, then there's hundreds of stores that are selling them, and usually they don't have sort of rigorous controls on how old you are, or they don't really care that where you're buying them from is illegal or whatever. They're just happy to make the sale. So that's a main source of people getting them as well. Jeepers. So, I mean, with all that in mind and what we've seen, particularly when we're here in Western Australia, so obviously we're seeing it happen a lot. What is the current estimates of the prevalence? Like, do we have those numbers either here or, in Australia or worldwide?
Yeah. Well, it varies hugely depending on age, country, the laws in the particular places where you're talking about. So in Australia, this sort of information is usually acquired by the government, and their latest data is from, I think, 2019, which is ancient history.
God, a long time ago.
In terms of vaping, I mean, people were doing it then, and it was on the increase.
Yes.
But it was sort of single-digit percentage, sort of 2, 3, 4% of people were classified as current users, which I think in their criteria is use in the last 30 days. So it doesn't mean they're like vaping every single day or heavy vapors. It's just that they've used one in the last month or so.
Okay.
Since then, there's been some smaller studies done, like state-based ones, New South Wales and Victoria in particular, showing that the prevalence is going up. It's going up really fast, and particularly in younger people. So 15 to 24-year-olds, the prevalence of vaping in Australia, even in where it's illegal, so around Australia, is sort of double digits percentages now for people who are using them on a regular basis. I've got some of the numbers right here, actually.
Yeah.
One of them was in 2022 in Victoria, current vaping was 6.1% for all adults. But if you're a female aged 18 to 24, it was 15.2%.
Wow.
Of people were current users. So that's up from 2.8% in 2018. So whatever that is, a seven-fold increase in the space of 4 years.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, that's kind of the consistent pattern across places. That it's increasing. Increasing more in younger people than older people.
And that's the really concerning part, isn't it? Particularly when I hear of, from teachers or high schoolers, that it's more, it's happening at schools more often because it's harder to trace and to track. And,
and it's becoming
such
normalised.
a vulnerable age.
It's true.
Where people are wanting to be part of, follow the crowd. And so that's where what you're doing, I think, looking at, the long-term impacts and kind of getting education about there is so important.
So important. So, I mean, the numbers are going up. Why is it so popular? Like, what are some of the reasons people are turning to
There's a whole range of reasons for that as well. And there's lots of research on why people take up vaping. And again, it depends on your age and your socioeconomic background and where you are and so on. But there's some consistencies. And some of the main ones are it's cheap. Compared to smoking or compared to anything, it's relatively cheap. You can buy one of those vapes that I talked about earlier, which has 6,000 puffs in it for $30.
Wow.
Right, so cheaper than half a packet of cigarettes.
Yeah.
So they're cheap. They're flavourful. So they're marketed in such a way that they look cool, they taste good, they're in colourful packaging, they're sort of high tech and cool to use. That's a perception that a lot of young people have. Wow. They come in all those thousands of different sort of candy and fruit and dessert flavours that are attractive.
Yeah.
You mentioned before, you can kind of use them incognito. So you can, if you're using it at school, for example, which a lot of kids are doing, there's lots of suspensions and things happening. You can have your little device in your pocket and have a puff on it, and basically no one knows. There's not a huge cloud of smoke. If you do it in a certain way, it's not a disgusting smell like a cloud of cigarette smoke. So kind of some of them smell a bit just like deodorant or whatever. So you can get away with it a bit easier. So there's a range of reasons, but yeah, and a lot of kids, a lot of the recent surveys show that the younger people try it out of curiosity. They're just interested.
Yeah.
My friends are doing it, I'll have a go.
Yeah.
And if they're using the disposables in particular, they're super high in nicotine, and they have a couple of goes and they're addicted, and then it's a sort of a downward spiral. I've got to keep going now because I can't get off them.
Oh, jeepers.
And at that age, I just think, it's obviously, and it's something that's becoming increasingly, I guess, spoken about, and an increasing issue. It's a huge thing, especially when you can't trace it and kids can go to the toilet or bathrooms and, be doing this a part of their day. It's it's a huge
a lot of schools are putting in detectors in the bathrooms and things now. I don't know how good they are. I don't have any experience with them, but they're designed to not just be smoke detectors for smoking like they might have been back in our day, but vape detectors in bathrooms, or some schools are preventing kids from going to the bathroom without like a teacher standing outside sort of thing, like just because it's so many people are doing it. Yeah. That they're having trouble figuring out ways to cut down. Yeah.
Wow. Oh. Let's get into
it's a bit scary.
It is a bit scary, but it's good to know about it. I think if you don't know about it, you just, you can't be naive about this, can you? So it's good. Yeah.
No, I appreciate this. I have 2 children who are not yet teenagers, but you always think when they hit this age and they're so vulnerable, and then if it's addictive and then these long-term effects, and they just, if we know the research, then we've got to, it's starting that education, isn't it? But we'll go into all of this more and more.
I've got 2 young kids as well, and I keep them up to speed on this sort of thing all the time so they know what's going on, because there's been primary school age kids who have stolen them from their older brother or their mum or whatever and poisoned themselves on it because they drink it or whatever. They get too much and have a nicotine reaction. So even really young kids aren't safe from these sorts of things.
Oh gosh!
And it's that familiarity as well. If they see their parents doing it, then they think, why not?
It's safe.
That's right. Okay, moving on a little bit, but still obviously keeping to this. In your latest article, you implemented a survey so we could improve our understanding of the Australian e-cigarette environment. What did your survey set out to achieve?
So this study was a bit different to what a lot of the other ones had done at the time for Australia, in that, surprisingly, there wasn't a lot of information on why adults were vaping, how they were vaping, where they were getting their products from. That's sort of just the basic demographics for an adult population. There was quite a lot. There's some very good research from some Eastern States groups looking at adolescents in particular, so the 15 to up to about 24 years of age, and also quite a bit on disadvantaged groups as well. But just on the regular, for want of a better word, adult Australian population, we didn't really know. And I was interested in that because I'm basically what we call a discovery scientist, get in the lab and measure some stuff to look for the health effects and that sort of thing. And we needed that information to inform our study design.
Sure.
So if everyone's using fruit-flavoured vapes with 20% nicotine or whatever, we want to make sure that we're doing relevant experiments in the lab.
Sure.
And that's what this set out to do.
Right.
The study's a little bit old now. Although we recently published it, the survey was done in 2020, I think, around COVID, just at the start of COVID time. But the data are still relevant, and it was some of the results were quite confronting, I guess.
Wow. Well, before we go into the results, just a little point there, because obviously this was published 2023, saying the study was kind of done 2020. 3 years is a long time for us to get articles published. Sometimes it does take a while, but 3 years, what happened there?
So we tried repeatedly to get this published and got knocked back from something like 6 or 8 journals, which does happen sometimes, and it was very frustrating that even reputable Australian-based journals who we thought might be interested in this sort of thing didn't like it. It was, in our opinion, a good study, well put together, not a huge sample size. We only had 500-odd completions of the survey at the end, but that's enough to get some information.
That's right,
so it was just not through want of trying. It was just one of those things that no one seemed to really like it until a couple of years later. And then it got published, and it was kind of a little bit old hat by the time it got published, but we still think it's useful information.
But it just shows how much it's evolved and changed over that time.
Absolutely.
The interest that you would have gotten recently is because we know it's a problem.
Yeah,
we need to look into it.
Yeah.
But it's
Maybe
back
that was
then,
part of it. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Interesting. Okay.
One of your facts I found very interesting was when you talked about who was included in the study was the percentage of current e-cigarette users that have children at home under 18 was over 50%.
Yes. So, yeah, that was one of the interesting findings, and also that a lot of them were vaping inside or around. It wasn't necessarily, we didn't ask a question, are you vaping in front of your kids, but do you have kids at home? Do you vape inside? And there was lots of synergies in that. So we know that there's probably kids who are obviously seeing their parents doing it. And again, that speaks to normalising it and that sort of thing. And also kids getting exposed to second-hand vape and third-hand vape, which is both of those things are very high in the sort of misconception. People think they can vape around anyone and there's no second-hand exposure.
Yeah.
Which is...
What's led to that? Why do we think that?
Well, I think it's because if you're smoking a cigarette and you put the cigarette down on the ashtray or whatever, there's still smoke coming off.
Sure.
Right? So if you're not puffing on it actively, there's still smoke that people get exposed to. With a vape, technically if you put the vape down, there's no vape coming off it. It's only when the person breathes it in that it activates and there's an aerosol produced. But that person breathes that out.
Yes.
Once you breathe in the aerosol, you breathe out like 90% of it. So it still goes into the room.
Sure.
Or wherever you are, in your car or outside.
Yeah.
Which is even probably a bit worse because all the secondhand vape that you're breathing in if you walk down the street behind someone has been in that person's lungs.
Yeah.
If you're breathing in secondhand smoke, it hasn't necessarily also been in someone's lungs. So if you smell vape on the street, someone's breathed that in and breathed it out. So I think that's probably some of the misconception. The other one is the fact that it causes third-hand exposure. So for smoking and vaping, third-hand is where someone is using one in a room or in a car and the smoke or the vape settles on the surfaces and then the person leaves and someone comes in later, which, again, for smoking, I don't want to belittle how bad smoking is, but most of the smoke, if you do it in a room, floats up and lines the walls and the roof. Yeah. So if a baby then crawls in, they're probably not going to get a huge exposure to smoke on the ground. But vape is heavier than air. So if you're using it in a room and you're breathing it out, anyone who uses vapes will know it's kind of a cloud and it will settle on surfaces.
Right.
And that's super high nicotine and all the other nasties. And a baby crawling around in its nappy, you can absorb that stuff through your skin.
Oh, my goodness.
So there's quite a bit of...
I never knew that.
Never thought about that.
No.
It's one of those things that people just haven't heard of. And there isn't a huge amount of research on it, but groups in Europe are doing this sort of thing, just trying to, like if you vape in a room, they come in later and swab surfaces and measure the level of certain chemicals and things. And there is definitely a risk of getting exposed to various nasties like that. And for little kids who expose a lot of skin and are on the floor or rolling around or whatever, that's potentially quite serious.
Never thought about that. So the point about babies is very alarming and skin absorption, which something I've never thought about.
No, I didn't know that.
It's quite alarming. But maybe let's go back then to some of the results in your study, because, I mean, why are people taking up this whole perception of safety, I think was what you had brought up before, but people are moving to e-cigarettes because they might think it's safer. Like that seems to be a bit of a perception. Can you talk us through about that? Because that's an interesting point. It
is one of probably the main reason that adults in particular who are smokers take up vaping, because there's a perception that it's safer for you than smoking, which is almost certainly true.
Yeah, okay.
There's numbers out there that are bandied around, and Public Health England spruiked a 95% safer than smoking number, which is wheeled out all the time.
Wow.
I would suggest if someone's listening to this, they look that up and how that number was made, how they decided on that. And it was basically they got a panel of 12 people, some of them who were vape manufacturers or got money from the vape industry, and they just pulled a number out of the air effectively.
Are we doing that again?
It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's been widely canned as not legit, and there's not really
conflict of interest.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you at the moment you can't really put a firm percentage on how much safer or not it is. But yeah, there's not much worse than you can breathe into your lungs than cigarette smoke. Yeah. And vaping, although likely to be less harmful just by the way that it works, and there's not combustion products technically, and tar and that sort of bits and pieces. It's going to be better, but it's far worse than not vaping in the first place. So if you're just breathing air, it's going to be worse than that.
Yeah.
So the perception that they're safer is a reason people switch or do both. That's what a lot of people who are smokers do. They try vaping to help quit and then find that it doesn't really work for them, or they kind of do a bit of vaping and a bit of smoking at the same time. So they get the worst of both worlds, for want of a better one. They get the nasties that are in the cigarettes and the nasties that are in the vapes, which are a bit of overlap but not entirely the same. And they're also taking them, again, the same sort of things that we talked about before. They're attractive flavours, they're cheaper.
Yeah.
My friend gave me one and I wanted to try it sort of lines, but it's mostly from an adult perspective. They're trying to use them to help quit smoking.
Right.
Unfortunately, the literature on whether that's actually efficacious or not is a bit of a grey area. So there was a very big study done by ANU researchers published last year, I think, 2022 now, we're in 2024 already, which showed that only under very specific circumstances and using with behavioural support and other things does vaping actually help someone quit.
Right.
And I guess the take-home message from that is vaping is not an approved smoking cessation tool.
Yes.
There's none of the companies who make them have sold them as that.
Yeah.
They're not allowed to. They haven't gone through TGA regulation processes.
Sure.
None of them are approved. And there are alternatives that are approved. So nicotine replacement therapy, the Nicorettes and all that all those sorts of things have gone through the process, testing, regulation, all that sort of stuff. But no e-cigarette anywhere in the world has been approved by any regulatory body for a smoking cessation device.
Oh, that's a good myth busting right there.
Yeah. So if you're thinking of using them for that purpose, GPs can now prescribe them to you, although a lot of GPs that I've spoken to don't really know how to prescribe them. Flavours are bad. What flavour do I do? What nicotine level do I do? What device? So there's a lot of uncertainty still there. So if someone's thinking of using these to help them quit smoking, speak to your GP for sure. Speak to the quit line. Speak to some experts, but try those approved things first.
Yes.
And the bottom line for smoking, one more last thing there, is that the vast majority of smokers who quit do so completely unaided. So they don't use any.
Wow.
So they just do it. So don't use nicotine replacement therapy. Don't do anything. Those things will help if you need them. Behavioural support and other things will help, but most people do it without any assistance. So try that first.
Cold turkey.
What really intrigues me is obviously we know that there's nicotine in it, but what else are we worried about in vaping? What is actually in it, or what are people breathing in?
Everything in there is bad. So nicotine is often wheeled out as the big bad at one end of the spectrum, and also nicotine's not so bad from the other end of the spectrum. And both of those things are kind of true. So nicotine has known effects on brain development in particular. So for the adolescents who might be using them when they're 14, 15, 16, their brain's still growing and developing. Don't know what that's going to do if they're using them then. We don't really know too much, although the literature suggests that it's bad if a pregnant mum vapes, then the nicotine gets into the baby just like it does if she smokes.
Okay.
So it's bad from that perspective.
Yep.
But from an adult vaping perspective, nicotine is not so bad. Apart from being super addictive, it's not carcinogenic or anything. So it's bad but not bad at the same time. So there's lots of, again, controversies and arguments there.
But the passive aspect, so once it's been exhaled and then the nicotine that does go there and it gets breathed in by a child, that would have an impact on their brain development?
Yeah, for sure. It's really dose dependent. They'd have to have a lot of it over a long period of time. And I don't think there's any actual studies on that sort of thing, but they would be getting exposed to some level of it, whether that's enough to cause an effect.
We just don't
know.
Right.
So in terms of the rest of it, there's so much stuff in there. There's a list is, I was going to say as long as your arm, but you'd have to have very long arms. So literally thousands and thousands of things. So the main stuff is the excipient, it's called. So that's the main bulk of the liquid that everything else is dissolved in. So it's the carrier solution, for want of a better word, which is often abbreviated to PG and VG. The PG stands for propylene glycol, which is the chemical that is used in smoke machines in discos of old and that sort of thing, right? So but there's more to that. So, and the other part is abbreviated VG, which is vegetable glycerin, which is possibly produced from vegetables, possibly not. You can make it from all sorts of sources industrially. Both of those on their own, quite safe.
Okay.
You could drink them effectively. They're simple alcohols. You wouldn't want to. I don't think they taste very good or anything, but they're not poisonous in of themselves to eat.
Okay.
But the difference is that these things are getting heated repeatedly to a couple of hundred degrees, cooled down, heated thousands of times potentially, and that changes them. That breaks them down into other stuff. And you're getting exposed by breathing it in. So getting exposed to something by breathing it in is very different to getting exposed to it by eating it.
Sure.
Your body is very good at dealing with nasty stuff that you eat.
Yes.
Gets through your liver and filtered and everything's can be okay. If you breathe it into your lungs, it gets straight into your bloodstream around your body and has worse effects generally.
Wow.
So the propylene glycol and the glycerin in that repeated heating and cooling cycle, as I said, break down by various chemical means that are beyond my chemical knowledge, but there's quite a lot of information on this, and then produce nasty things that people have heard of. So one of the main ones is formaldehyde, which is the embalming fluid effectively. That's produced particularly if the temperature of the vape is on the higher end, but even most of them produce even small amounts of that. Other things that people may have heard of, so another one is acetaldehyde, which is the chemical that your body makes when it's breaking down alcohol that causes you to have a hangover.
Oh my goodness.
So the nasty feeling you get after having too many drinks, that's acetaldehyde being produced and going around your body. E-cigarette aerosol contains that. Other products, there's acrolein, which is used as a weed killer in aquatic weeds. Various other nasties that are produced just by that. So if you have nothing else in the e-liquid, just the propylene glycol and the glycerin, which basically no one does because they want the flavour in there and they want the nicotine in there, even then you're still breathing in some potentially harmful stuff, carcinogenic things. Again, it depends on how you're doing it, whether the dose you're getting is enough to cause whatever. And no one's been using them long enough to know, really.
Sure. But we know nicotine's addictive.
We know nicotine's addictive, And then the other stuff in there, so you've got your carrier fluids, you've got your nicotine, then it's the flavouring. And almost everyone, all the disposables are flavoured. Very few people use unflavoured liquids. In our study, we showed, I can't remember what it was, 1% or something, because why would you? You're going to do this anyway. And the chemicals that they put in there to flavour them are generally, almost, I don't think any of them are approved to be breathed into your lungs. So they're often food stuffs. So they're called, it's called GRAS, G-R-A-S, which is generally regarded as safe, is what that stands for. So it will be chemicals that you'll get in your, it doesn't sound very good, but it goes in lollies or whatever, cakes and things. And again, safe to eat because your body breaks it down in a different way. But whether it's safe to breathe in, for a lot of the stuff we don't know. And that list of flavourings is literally hundreds and hundreds of chemicals. Even if you picked berry flavour, there might be a dozen different chemicals in that particular one that they use to make berry, whatever it is. Obviously not real berries, but things with long chemical sounding names. And they're either, we don't know what they do when you breathe them in. Some of them we do. And if we do know, then it's bad. Like none of them have positive health effects. None of them are tonics or medicines, but if we don't know, then it's negative health effects.
But it's so hard you can't regulate it, can you? Because the sale of it's illegal. So really, and there's obviously this black market for selling them and getting them out there. So
the Australian government has tried a little bit to regulate. So there is a list of 8 ingredients that are banned in e-liquids in Australia. 8. Which is a start. Out of the studies showing there's hundreds and hundreds of different things. And the manufacturers can just work around it. So in the US, they were, I don't know if they've done it or not, but they were going to ban menthol in e-cigarettes because menthol makes them taste better. So you get addicted faster, it doesn't burn your throat, and also increases the addictiveness of the nicotine. So they were going to ban it for that reason. And the manufacturer said, okay, do that. And they put in a synthetic menthol, which is not banned and has been banned in the EU because it causes cancer or whatever. And that's what our researchers found in Australia. They all contain this artificial menthol rather than regular menthol to sort of circumvent the rules in other places.
Oh my goodness!
So it's a rapidly evolving area. That's the thing.
Is that why the laws are always changing? It's trying to
catch up.
Yeah.
And researchers like myself are trying to provide that evidence to know, okay, this chemical which produces banana flavour is toxic to whatever. And there's lots of people doing that sort of research at the moment.
That's really interesting. I found really interesting in this survey as well was just some more of the stats. Can you just go through some of the stats with us? You don't have to rattle them all off
I
exactly
don't know any of them off the top of my head. I have to look at my notes here.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. But I just found it quite interesting with regards to just describing who is using it and what for and how long are they doing it for and even just the unpleasant health effects, because we know that from how you described it, but when you're actually smoking e-cigarettes, are there any unpleasant side effects so far? It seems to be they all love to do it.
Yeah, well, it's surprising there are.
Yeah.
But people still suffer through it and use them. So there's a thing called nick-sick, which is what the younger people call it, which is feeling dizzy or lightheaded or vomiting or even diarrhea, nasty, unpleasant sensations from nicotine, having too much nicotine, which, from what I've heard, is something that they occasionally try to do. So they try and get the head spins and whatever by overdosing on the nicotine. Okay. So there's that. A fair proportion of the adults that we surveyed reported health effects like irritated eyes, nose and throat, which again is not surprising if you're breathing in something that your body's not used to. So cough, that sort of stuff.
Okay.
In terms of that then progressing into disease, the data's just not there yet. Not really. So there is a bit of bits and pieces on causing sort of dental issues and other things and nicotine poisoning and other stuff, but long-term effects on cardiovascular health or causing cancer, the information's just not there. No one's been using them for long enough to know.
I mean, it feels like the early days when everyone's learning about just cigarettes, right?
We would have hoped we'd learnt our lesson from that, but obviously we haven't.
It feels like we're starting again, that whole process and catching up with what this means.
And I guess we know cigarettes are bad. We know they kill, I can't remember what it is, 2 out of every 5 people who are long-term smokers. But the scariest part of some of the more recent research is that, particularly for younger people who vape, they're 3 times more likely to take up smoking than if they don't vape. So there's this gateway effect as well.
Sure.
So people look at them, maybe it's going to help me quit smoking.
Yeah.
Probably true in some certain circumstances. But for the younger people in particular, using vapes, they've never smoked before, get on the vapes at school, they're 3 times more likely to take up cigarette smoking.
It's an alarming number.
Yeah, and if they do that from when they're 20,
you're going
to have some health problems later on.
That's huge.
I had a question that I'd written to ask, and I feel like it's been answered. Do you think is it actually safe or not? It's clearly not safe.
Well, I got my notes here, and the answer to that, I just put no in big letters. So, I think we probably answered that one.
Yeah.
How harmful it is still being worked out.
Sure.
It's, as I said, almost certainly better than smoking, but as is everything else. But far worse than not doing it in the first place. Just if you don't need to vape, then just don't.
Just don't. Yeah.
What would your advice be to parents then? Like, how do we, because you don't want to bring up too much because you don't want to tell them too much about something and something that they didn't know about. But obviously we also want to be educated. What would your advice be?
I would think that 99% of teenagers would know or think they know far more about vaping than their parents. Whether it's what they know is accurate or not, they're going to think they know it. And they'll go, oh, Mum, I know that, whatever. So my advice to the parents would be swat up on some information.
Yes.
And there's lots of reliable sources that you can go to online. Any state or federal government website has a vaping advice or information, sort of stuff we've talked about today. They have those sorts of resources available, and some of them are directly targeted at parents and or teachers, so how they can kind of communicate with the younger people to get this information across.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that. And some of there's other ones as well. So I recommend that maybe if they want to tread lightly, they could suggest their kids go to certain websites. There's one that's recently been launched called uncloud.org, which is designed to appeal. I've been a part of kind of putting it together. So it's a conflict of interest to some extent, but it's legit. Other experts as well have contributed to it, and it's designed to be sort of a safe space for younger people to come and
Sure.
find out information, ask questions,
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff
Yeah.
about vaping.
Yeah.
So, maybe just
Great, all
point
good
them towards that.
resources, because
Yep.
if you're educated and you can empower that, and it's also educating the children on what they read, isn't it?
Yeah.
And if you can provide them a source that's giving them accurate information.
Just make sure you go, reliable source. So if it ends in .gov.au, then it's usually pretty good. Yep.
Yeah, sure. We might just grab some of those links and we'll pop them on our website so
Absolutely.
people can use that
Sure.
too. Because I think it's the world of the internet, right? We've spoken about this so many times before. It's just uncurated.
I think if you type in like just something like vaping health effects
Right.
into Google, you're going to get the first page is going to be littered with misinformation, information from companies who are selling them. Yeah, vaping's 100% safe and that sort of stuff, mixed in with some reliable stuff. So
Sure.
knowing who you can believe and who you can't is
Yeah.
the first step.
It's huge.
Yeah. So final question before we head into Ed. I'm sure Ed's got some good questions here. What will be your sort of future direction in your research for this? Like, you're probably working on it now. What are you doing in light of all of this?
We're doing a big project at the moment looking at, so one of the studies we kind of talked about today was us looking at the e-liquids, the chemistry of the e-liquids, which was a couple of years ago, a lot of news interest, and I did lots of interviews and stuff. But it's not flawed. It's limited in that we looked at the liquids, and you're not breathing in the liquid. You breathe in the aerosol that the liquid produces. So it ignores all that heating and cooling and that sort of stuff. So we're taking that to the next step now, where we've got some more modern devices. We're making the aerosol come out of them, collecting that, measuring that chemically. We're also exposing some lung cells that we've got from teenagers who've gone into Perth Children's Hospital for elective surgery. We can get lung cells out of them, grow it in the lab, and they basically replicate the lung. They produce mucus and all the inflammatory markers and everything else.
Yep.
So we can then put vape aerosol on those and measure a whole range of outcomes, a whole lot of stuff without exposing anyone directly, which is obviously ethically challenging.
Yes.
And so those are some of the things we're looking at. We also want to kind of our expertise to some extent is looking at the flavouring chemicals and seeing which ones may be more or less harmful than others. So
sounds good.
probably expanding that list of 8 banned ingredients is the next step. It should be fairly easy to get that to 100 or something. Or just saying, okay, everyone who wants to use it as it is now, you could have a prescription, but you can only have unflavoured e-liquids, or you can only use this particular flavour, that sort of thing. So that's a fair way down the track.
Okay.
So that's one thing. The other thing is getting the message across.
Yeah.
So doing this sort of thing and other bits and pieces that I do and our team does from time to time, trying to dispel some misconceptions and educate people about what the latest is and what they should know. That's kind of our day-to-day a little bit as well.
Well, we'll make sure we keep in touch, because as this evolves, I think we need to keep up to date with it.
Yeah,
it's really important.
I think in a year or two there'll be a whole different things that we know.
Like
and the laws may have changed again too.
Guaranteed something will have changed.
Yeah. Well, before we finish, let's head into a very popular segment. Everyone always waits for this one because they wait for the all-anticipated question from the producer, Ed. So here we go. Tell it to Ed. Ed is our producer. He doesn't have a background in child health, but he has been listening on this conversation, taking notes on occasion, nodding his head from time to time as he contemplates what his question might be. Before we get to that, though, Alex, I'll get you to give Ed a bit of a summary of what we spoke about today in about 60 seconds or so. And
Absolutely.
Ed, you'll have time for a question.
So I guess my summary of this would be the take-home messages, which is, firstly, vaping isn't harmless water vapour. That's still a misconception people have out there. There's all sorts of nasties in there. They're highly addictive. So if you're not needing to vape, which no one really needs to, then don't. If you want to use them to help quit smoking, do it through the legitimate channels, get a prescription, try everything else first. That would be my 2 take-home messages. The third one is they're illegal. So if you're doing this, you probably know it already, you're breaking the law. So that might dissuade some people, probably not. But just think of your health, I guess, is the bottom line. These things are going to cause negative health effects and cause problems down the track.
Yeah, that's a great summary. Very punchy. Done this before. Ed, over to you.
So today's conversation's been enlightening. I didn't know half of what you guys have been talking about. But it's incredible to me that I think you touched on it. Like we seem to be prone to repeating the mistakes of the past, and like the powerful tobacco lobby and how much influence they've kind of wielded over time and told a story that left out either some or all of the facts or presented a completely different view. And I guess you've done a great job of distilling like all the information to like easily digestible parts for someone like myself, which is great. But I guess from a research perspective, I'm trying to figure out how best the research can take on these kind of lobby and interest groups. Obviously, they're pushing a product. You've touched on the fact that we know that this is a product that is harmful. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of how much harm it causes. And you touched on the website, the uncloud.org. And obviously that kind of helps to break some of the information down, and it's a curated list. And I wonder whether researchers kind of banding together a little bit to get a singular cohesive voice that is better positioned to be able to take on these kind of lobby groups. So obviously the internet is very uncurated. It's so much information, and people can struggle to kind of get to the source of true information. How is there a plan, or are there lots of individual groups and organisations that are kind of tackling this in different parts? And sorry for the long.
No, it's okay. I mean, there's both of those things happening. There are half a dozen or more research groups in Australia doing bits and pieces in this space. Everyone's kind of focusing on their specialties.
Yes.
But we do talk.
Yeah.
There's a national consortium of researchers, which I can't remember, at last count has about 50 people on it who we meet on a regular basis. And there's smaller groups within Western Australia. There's one led by Cancer Council where everyone with kind of an interest in this or doing research in this area gets together, and we kind of talk and try and get that cohesive message across.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has really come to the fore in just the last maybe 6 months. Or a year or so. If you had looked for the sort of information that we talked about before this time last year online, it'd be a real struggle to find the legit stuff. But now, as I said, the state governments have put things together which the researchers have informed. So it's all research-based, evidence-based information that's reliable, and they put their sources on the bottom there. So hopefully that makes it believable. Yeah. In terms of fighting the sort of the big tobacco messages of the past, I mean, that's, we try to do that, but I always think of myself as a lowly researcher, not primarily as an advocacy expert. So there are people who do that. I'm a member of ACOSH, the Australian Council on Smoking and Health, which is based in WA, Healthway funded group who has a long history of kind of flying that flag.
Yeah, sure.
And we are, it's in terms of both tobacco and more e-cigarette stuff now. So there is a lot of people working on this. I don't want to say the ship has sailed for vaping, but it's kind of exponentially we're trying to catch up and get the message across. So, and the government is doing the same. There are new laws, all the stuff is evolving. Hopefully, if I come back and talk to you again in a couple of years, maybe we'll see those upward trajectories plateau or drop off. That would be awesome.
Yeah. No, that'd be really good. Well, that's a good question. I think that's always an important point. It's knowledge translation, really, at the end of the day,
100%.
isn't it? Yep. Right? That's the big part. So, look, to all of our listeners, we'll put all those links on our website, researchworks.net. So please do head there if you want to have more of those reliable sources of information and, talk to other families about it too, and let's spread the word about this. And, of course, there's a CPD form there as well you can fill out if you want to keep this as part of a record of your PD requirements. But for now, thank you so much for your time. Can't begin to stress how useful that was and how enlightening that was.
Message. I'll be your fellow advocate.
So. Thank you. My pleasure. I'm glad we hopefully have got some message to a few people who are listening to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again, and we'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.